Hi there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be tackling an album I've been looking forward to all year, Knock Madness from Hopsin. Now, before we start, I'd like to take care of a brief piece of old business from one of my most viewed and most openly reviled reviews, wherein I covered Cage's album Kill the Architect. Now, since that review, I've re-listened to that album several times, like trying to see what other people clearly found so inspirational and powerful that they felt content to hurl all manner of abuse at me. And I'd like to make a small correction to that review. No, I'm not recanting it, but I don't feel that I quite represented myself as well as I could have. In that review, I drew several comparisons with Kill the Architect to Eminem's album Encore, and I made the comment that Cage had lost his ability to shock me in his raps in the same way. Now, some people took umbrage to that by stating that Cage wasn't trying to do that on this album, instead opting for a more introspective focus and message. And you know what? I'll agree with that. But here's where I feel I have to make a clarification. My issue with Kill the Architect was never the change in subject matter or tone, moving towards what some would argue to be more mature subject matter. My issue is that it didn't resonate with me as anywhere close to compelling, half because Cage's delivery was more low-key and lacking in energy than ever, and half because the insights he was providing into the current state of affairs just felt strangely muted and distant and not all that insightful. It was an awkward fit for the guy, and while some people might definitely empathize with his inner turmoil, hell, I could even empathize with it at some points, it just felt like steps taken in a downward spiral without the slightest desire to come back out. And as I've said time and time again, nihilistic artwork can get really boring or absolutely intolerable if there's no deeper context or nuance to the material. In contrast, for example, Nine Inch Nails and The National both made dark, somewhat depressing albums this year about people introspectively exploring their lives on a downward spiral, but they tempered that depression with rich context and compelling instrumentation and coherent focus, none of which I felt that Cage brought to the table. But then again, this prompted an interesting question for me to ask myself. Most critics tend to be harsher on acts that shift their artistic direction and subject matter from their established formulas. Hell, I'd even argue that I'm somewhat guilty of that. So why as a critic do we do it? Well, part of it is obviously linked to comfort with the familiar, but I think a greater portion of it is that when artists decide to shift artistic direction, critics have an automatic expectation that the artist is knowledgeable enough about the genre that they're moving into that they can execute that shift and still maintain their strengths as an artist. And to be fair, a lot of artists just can't pull it off. So instead, let's talk about an artist who does seem to be on the right track with his artistic shifts, Hopsin. Now, he's a relatively new arrival to the scene, as he's an LA rapper who drew a lot of his inspiration and flow from Eminem off for his first releases, which had trace elements of horrorcore fused with straightforward, hard-hitting, well-composed hip-hop. This guy is a phenomenal lyricist, and that's one of the reasons I listen to his albums as much as I do. But in 2012, he released Ill Mind of Hopsin 5, a charged track targeting trends in youth today, with vitriol and biting insight, and it's a track I really did enjoy. It was a phenomenal change of pace, and it showed that Hopsin had potential for societal commentary beyond his previous work, that he could really transition to that of a conscientious rapper. But then he released Ill Mind of Hopsin 6, Old Friend, this year, and I didn't quite like it as much. Sure, it felt genuine and emotionally grounded, and I could definitely feel where Hopsin was coming from, but the sharp anti-drug screed felt less like it was trying to appeal to my mind and more that it was just trying to tug on my heartstrings. And look, I felt it was a bit of a step down artistically from the previous track. It shows one of the occasional weaknesses of message-driven music, jettisoning the nuance in favor of broader emotional messaging that might prove more accessible to a wider audience, to be sure, and have that degree of populism, but doesn't quite contain the same punch or impact that a more focused approach would bring. And thus, to be honest, I wasn't quite sure to expect with his most recent album, Knock Madness. Recorded over a period of 2 years, how was Hopsin going to reflect his dramatic shifts in direction over this recording period? Well, it's kind of funny that you should mention that, because it might just be the overarching thematic progression of the entire album, that question. Yes, Hopsin has chosen to use Knock Madness as a chance to dive deep into exploring the dichotomy between his personal life and his rap alter ego. And I cannot deny that it's an interesting little adventure that I can definitely recommend. But is the album any good? Well, yeah, it really is kind of good. Even though there are several issues that really don't help this album's overall presentation and do knock it down a few points for me. I find it more than a little interesting that this album and the Marshall Mathers LP2 were released so close together, because in my mind's eye, I can't help but see them as two sides of the same coin. Now, okay, that's a pretty big assertion, so let me try to explain this and start with, well, a good place to start is Hopsin himself. On a technical level, this guy is incredibly strong, and I'd be hard-pressed to find even a few poorly constructed lyrics or punchlines. He has phenomenal flow, a gift from many different technical rhyming styles and cadences, and he can hold his own at impressive speeds. Hell, he will only collaborate with other rappers who work with him on that same level, and that's an impressive statement of purpose, to say the least. In other words, this is an album where Hopsin can collaborate with Tech Nine and match that rapper's lyrical dexterity and speed, and you just don't see that in the scene anymore. He has great rapport and chemistry with frequent collaborator Swizz on their title Jungle Beats, and which is a track I really liked. And unlike Eminem, Hopsin's actually a halfway decent singer. He's by no means fantastic, let me stress this, but he's passable enough on the hooks that he doesn't need to rely on the cavalcade of female singers that Eminem keeps recruiting for his hooks. And you know what? Hopsin singing his hooks can occasionally add a little bit more of that emotional resonance to the tracks. They feel a little bit more personal. My one big criticism is that he can sometimes come across a little bit broad in his emotional delivery, particularly during some of the sillier tracks. Now look, I know they're part of a character that he's trying to play, but there just isn't a lot of subtlety in his delivery. There aren't enough of those quieter moments, even when he's playing for more serious beats like An Old Friend, and I feel those moments could have really helped him on this record. More on this in a bit. Now, believe it or not, this is also somewhat echoed in his instrumentation, which I do like for the most part. There's a certain amount of bombast and presence and some great melody lines that do a lot for his hooks. Now, there are some also phenomenal grooves on this album and a fair amount of instrumental diversity to really keep me interested and engaged, with some extremely solid hooks that do stick in the memory. But yeah, at points, it does feel a little bit too classy and slick to really fit with the subject material, with the piano and the strings and the funk and disco inspired grooves on tracks like Gimme That Money and Still Got Love For You. But you know what? The melodies are solid, and I did like that Hopsin was experimenting with different instrumental styles, and he is growing as a producer. However, more often than not, his instrumentation and production is just a little bit too exaggerated, and production just a little bit too cartoonish and lacking in those quieter moments that could really add some impact and deeper character to the songs. Now, it's a similar issue that I've actually run into with Tech Nine in the past, where I find the songs can be a little bit better if they opt for less grandiose or bombastic instrumentation, or at least have some juxtaposition between the two, move into drama rather than melodrama, in other words. Once again, it just reflects a little bit of a lack of subtlety, which sure can be appealing, in which the straightforward honesty in which Hopsin presents his content. His method of delivering his content definitely matches his instrumentation, but when his instrumental texture is compromised, which it is on a few tracks here, it doesn't quite match up with his well-constructed lyricism. Now, a bigger problem is that it can occasionally run contrary to the messages he puts forward in his music. With exaggerated, broader instrumentation, it just becomes a little harder to take Hopsin as seriously as he might want me to. And here's where we have to talk about lyrics and themes, and what Hopsin is trying to do with this release. Now, from his point of view, he's experiencing fame and some degree of success as an underground rapper, and yet his personal life hasn't quite gone the way he wants, how he still feels very incomplete. And really, the best moments of this album is where he directly tackles these themes and tries to get the root of his frustrations with his career, his peers, and society at large, especially the music industry. And you could tell from songs like The Fiends Are Knocking that he's stunned that he's having any sort of impact on people at all, and you can hear his deep-seated rage at the mainstream hip-hop scene that other rappers aren't using their fame and populism to say anything of value. Even if I disagree with his opinion on Yeezus, I can understand the content behind the Kanye West disc on Hop Is Back. Tracks like Tear to Snow, I Need Help, Hip Hop Sinister, and especially Caught in the Rain, probably my favorite song on the album, show that Hopsin struggled to connect with his fans beyond his Hopsin alter ego, his open contempt for the music industry, and his struggles with the lack of genuine people who flocked to him after he was successful. It seems like even though he was surrounded by success, he feels lonelier than ever, and he's more than willing to retire and just settle into a normal life, even run off to Australia, like one of my eventual plans, rather than compromise his artistic principles. Which, to be fair, that's a powerful statement coming from a successful rapper. And you know what the best thing of all of it? It feels genuine. It feels real. And while the character of Hopsin can spit all manner of crushing, potent vitriol, which, to be fair, he's got good enough wordplay and he's got enough interesting punchlines to make that material all the more interesting, he's just sick of that persona's somewhat shallowness, and he wants to make more conscientious rap music, even if it doesn't get popular in the same vein. Although, with the change in climates in rap, I think it might. And with that vein, you can also see the stark parallels with the Marshall Mathers LP2, with both rappers reacting with some disbelief that people actually bought into their broader messages and that they had any mainstream impact at all. And here's where things get kind of interesting from an artistic point of view, because there's a marked difference between the antics of Slim Shady and the antics of Hopsin, and it comes down to artistic framing. You see, like, Eminem has always hammered on in several of his songs that the despicable, disgusting things he says and threats of violence that he's made as Slim Shady were always meant to be viewed with revulsion and disgust and hatred. We're not supposed to empathize with that material, let alone embrace it as so many angry white boys did in the late 90s and early 2000s. Sure, he has blurred the line between himself and his character, but neither one was someone that the audience is supposed to idolize or want to be like. And here's where Hopsin gets into somewhat tricky territory, because his character is less focused on the over-the-top debauched nightmares and more on cutting societal commentary, looking at the problems in the world and screaming, "What the hell is wrong with you people?" And there are many points where that blurring of the line between the character that he's playing and the rapper himself can make his character slightly more sympathetic and a rapper that you might want to more recognize with and relate to. And yet, this bizarrely becomes a bit of a problem. As much as he tries to separate his Hopsin alter ego from himself, the line still sometimes blurs, and he begins to lose some of the same rationalization Eminem has for using, let's say, homophobic slurs and casual sexism. In fact, if we were looking for a weak point on this album, Hopsin's issues with women, it would be it. Look, I'm not in the business of criticizing rappers for their content because, let's face it, a lot of them say some pretty terrible things. But the thing is, Hopsin's trying to present himself as someone who's speaking truth to stupid. And with someone with that degree of enlightened attitude, you can't exactly excuse this sort of thing. Now, the worst song on this album by a mile is Good Guys Get Left Behind, because it paints Hopsin's bitterness as being used by an ex in such stark degrees that it's hard to be excusable under, well, it's all just a character. It makes matters all the worse that he just uses comparisons to Bella and Edward from Twilight to describe his nice guy relationship that he wants to idealize with the girl in question. And having read those godforsaken books, I couldn't think of a worse metaphor to articulate a good relationship. Now, this has been an issue, his issues with women, since Ill Mind of Hopsin 5, and frankly, the slut shaming on this album gets a whole lot worse. And considering how much solid societal commentary that Hopsin has on the youth of today, how many relevant things he has to say, it's frustrating that his gender politics remains lodged in some of the bad conventions of the hip-hop genre. You'd honestly think he'd be a little bit more progressive in this field. What makes matters all the worse is that this bitterness on these songs is so potent on songs like Still Got Love For You, where he's trying to support a girl pregnant with a baby that isn't his, that he's trying to frame it, that he's doing it all for love, and he just doesn't come across as all that attractive on that song. Or take that song, Gimme That Money, where the only woman who manages to scam him out of any money whatsoever is an ex-girlfriend. Or even on Dream Forever, where Hopsin retreats into an idealized fantasy because that's the only place he can find his perfect woman, and then he kind of offs himself in mid-song to try and reach her, and I'm sorry, that does not look good. And look, I can empathize with Hopsin here, given his wealth and success and how some women probably throw themselves at him for the chance for fame. I can understand his frustration at his lack of genuine relationships and his feelings of isolation and loneliness. Heck, we've all been there if you've been successful in any way, shape, or form. But I don't think his response will help matters all that much, because at points he can come across as a little bit petulant, which will probably be the biggest complaint some people will have with this record. Again, this is a bit of an issue with delivery. As I've already said, Hopsin for the majority of this album is just flying on all cylinders, with frustration and rage providing the raw energy to power through the songs, which really makes this album something of a quick listen, to be frank. But without those quieter, reflective moments where his insight could be a little bit more focused, this album just feels like it's lacking a little bit of weight, even though he is tackling some big, important subject matter. Honestly, I think more songs from Marcus could have really elevated this album into something truly striking and truly special. See more of the man behind the alter ego and contacts. I feel that with the sort of commentary Hopsin makes needs some level of introspection to properly balance it out. And while some of it is here to be sure, it's not quite as nuanced or fully fleshed out, which can make his petulant moments come across as a little overwrought and hard to take seriously. That, believe me, that really does suck, because I know all of his feelings are coming from a very real place, and his manner of delivery makes it feel that he really cares about what he's selling. But it just came across as a little bit too broad for me, and it didn't quite land as well as I was hoping. So, look, in summary, despite all of my criticisms, pretty harsh criticisms I'd argue, I really did like Hop Madness by Hopsin here. If you're looking for records for sheer tradecraft and sheer ability to spit hard-hitting rhymes, you're not gonna find many better ones this year, because Hopsin has a gift for great wordplay and infusing it with very solid messages for the most part. If he was looking for a rapper to elevate conscious rap to mainstream successes, if I was looking for a rapper who could do that, Hopsin would be on my list, probably be near close to the top. Now, I'm as harsh on this album as I am because he's a rapper that I really want to see succeed. With all that in mind, I really did struggle for my rating for this album, but in recognition of some great wordplay and the fact that it can just work on some levels as just a shallow spitting of great punchlines, and the fact that more people should just be listening to this guy already, I'm going to give him an 8 out of 10 and a definite recommendation for this album. And look, Hopsin, if by some fluke you happen to come across this review, dude, I really like what you're doing. But sometimes, you know what, you should just let the words and the message speak for themselves. You don't need to overemphasize it and oversell it. You don't need it, because trust me when I say that a lot of people in our generation here, we're waking up to the facts of life here. And keep on rapping, man. We need guys like you. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to fix my presentation, or if there's any other albums you'd like me to cover, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. Until then, see you next time.